My name is Charlie Kolstad. I'm here at Stanford University. And in case you haven't quite figured out how the program is structured, we have three panels. The first panel is sort of talking about today. No federal action on climate change to speak of. And the second panel is talking about moving forward and putting in some sort of meaningful regulation. And then the last panel is talking about after we have the meaningful regulation, what happens. So I suppose our task here is a little more dismal than speculating on what the future may bring. But we have a great panel nevertheless. Let me just say a few words about them. I'll start with Carolyn Fischer here. She's a very productive and distinguished environmental economist and a musician. We actually have a couple of musicians up here. Long-based resources for the future, but I believe it's coincident with the last presidential election. She moved to Europe and is now splits her time between Washington, Ottawa, and Amsterdam, Free University of Amsterdam. She's one of the world's leading researchers on tradable performance standards and output-based rebating. And for those of you that are unaware, there's a paper out front on that topic itself, which is very, very well done, and I certainly encourage people to look at it. It's sponsored by the Hamilton Project, so it's sort of integral to our session today. Larry Goulder is at the end, and he's also a musician. So maybe we can get a performance after the questions run out. He's a major intellectual force in shaping environmental regulations, particularly second-best regulations, which we'll talk about a bit here. And I'm privileged to have him as a colleague here at Stanford. And by the way, there are longer bios with some of the accomplishments in your material. Nancy Sutley is Chief Sustainability Officer for the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, affectionately known as LADWP. And for those of you who haven't seen Chinatown, it's a very major player in energy and water provision here in California. And then Nat Keohane, who's to my right, a former professor of management at Yale. He's now vice president for the Environmental Defense Fund. In my opinion, the leading NGO in promoting market solutions to environmental problems. So what we're going to do here is we're going to have a couple of rounds of questions that I'm going to pose to different people, and then we'll have a discussion amongst us, and then the last portion will be Q&A from the audience on the little cards that you're familiar with, I gather. They're somewhere around anyway. So let me start out by asking Carolyn. You've written a very persuasive document on tradable performance standards as an alternative to a carbon tax, or maybe to supplement a carbon tax. Of the various reasons for instituting something like a tax with output-based rebating, maybe you can explain some of these terms, recognizing that not everybody has read your paper, at least explain them to a limited extent. Of the various reasons for instituting output-based rebating, what is the most important feature to suggest it's better than a plain old carbon tax? And I'll just list several that you list. One is trade-exposed industries / carbon leakage out of the country. Second is distributional consequences. It seems to have a lot more favorable equity implications than a tax. Political feasibility, and ultimately, if things aren't politically feasible, there's no point talking about them, or something else.
Okay, well, thanks, Charlie. I think you've already answered the question. But
which is the most important was the question.
Right. I would say that the two primary ones, I guess for me, they're so one is political, and then the other is economic. And just to give a little bit of background, I was asked to answer a challenge of, so in the absence of a federal broad-based carbon pricing plan, what kind of policies can we use? And it's hard to ask economists this because we like to go on and on about carbon pricing. It is, a fabulous instrument that really brings forth all of the incentives to do, everything in any way you can to reduce emissions. However, if you ask people what kinds of policies they would like to see, carbon tax is way down on the list and does not get a majority of support, except among, left-leaning people and, California. If you ask people, well, what policies do they support for addressing climate change and reducing emissions, you hear things like renewable portfolio standards. Let's set performance standards for industry. So you hear a lot more about standards. And so the idea here is to, so if you read the little piece, is to kind of bridge the divide between the economists and the people. Because there are ways that you can, start with standards, but then, they're a familiar tool. There's often regulatory authority for doing it, but then you can design them in ways that are more market-based, and then you can use them to build up towards more broad-based carbon pricing. So that's kind of the idea. So let's get something that's acceptable, that people are familiar with and trust as a policy, but let's do it well. Let's design it well and in a way that actually can bring forth carbon pricing. So how does this work? Well, think of a performance standard. The essential feature of a performance standard is that you set a benchmark for emissions that you either shouldn't exceed. If you exceed it, you pay a penalty. Well, let's make that a little more market-based. Okay, let's make it maybe tradable. Okay, so you have a benchmark of emissions. If you exceed that benchmark, then you have to pay for those emissions. You have to purchase credits. If you reduce below that benchmark, then you can sell credits into the system. So then you have emissions. All your changes in emissions are then priced. You pay for it, additional emissions, or you get a credit for reducing. You save money by reducing emissions. So that's starting to make it market-based. A key feature then with this benchmark, though, is that it's per unit of output. Okay, so the more you produce, you get your benchmark emissions. So that's like an incentive to produce, or incentive not to, reduce or shut down your manufacturing as a way of reducing your emissions. So you're really combining a price on emissions with that credit value with an incentive for output. And that incentive, economists worry that then you're disincentivizing conservation as a way of reducing emissions, but there are certain circumstances where you actually don't want to do that. And one example, and I think for me the main example, is if you're trade exposed. If these are firms that are competing with folks in other jurisdictions that don't have to pay for their carbon emissions, then it's a way of keeping the playing field more level. So you're actually incentivizing emissions reductions, but you're not jeopardizing competitiveness and inducing carbon leakage.
Okay, thanks. Larry, the order we told people would be in was different than where we are in, so I'm jumping around. Larry, you've examined alternatives to carbon taxes and cap and trade in your recent work, particularly, and recently you've argued for second best policies. The economist, that just means
some people would say fifth best.
Some people say fifth best. There's an ideal way to do it, but if you can't do that, there's second, third, fourth, fifth best, and the idea is that the perfect is the enemy of the good. So let's see if we can get something in. That's better than continually working for the best. So do you agree with Carolyn that policymakers should modify their push for a revenue-neutral carbon tax, which has been pushed by a lot of people, including people here at Stanford, supporting output-based rebating of revenue instead?
I do agree with Carolyn with some qualifications. I really like the spirit of Carolyn's excellent paper, which is to say if we've got a lot of support for performance standards, maybe what we can use in the short term, why don't we use them as well as we can, and then maybe ultimately they can morph into the holy grail, which is uniform carbon pricing via cap and trade or a carbon tax. And her main effort or emphasis in what you just said is make them work well partly by making them market-based. Another thing you emphasize in your paper is that an attraction of performance standards is that they can be customized. That is, they can treat different industrial sectors, and you focus on industrial sectors, differently. Like you can treat the metals industry different from pulp and paper. For many economists, that generates a bit of consternation because we generally favor uniformity. Indeed, that's a big attraction of a broad-based single price on carbon, be it through cap and trade or carbon tax. So why would we want to treat different sectors differently? Why would that be a positive feature of performance standards? One that you mentioned is that the energy-intensive trade-exposed sectors might need special help on the international market not to lose competitive advantage. Also, there's reasons in terms of imperfect competition in some industries, as Lucas, if I recall correctly, has done in a nice paper, Lucas Davis here, shows that in the natural gas industry, some market imperfections, perfect competition, mean that if you have a uniform carbon price, the price of natural gas may not be optimal from a social point of view. You might want to treat that sector differently. So I like that point about customizing, but I think it needs to be interpreted carefully because you could have an augmented national level carbon tax or cap and trade package that is a carbon tax or cap and trade policy that also has some sector-specific features. For example, to deal with international leakage, you could have output-based allocation for the energy-intensive trade-exposed industries, which is what was promised in Waxman-Markey, the bill that didn't pass, never got entered into the Senate. And in California, we have output-based allocation. So we already do have some customizing under cap and trade. And also to deal with imperfect competition, you could have sector-specific tax incentives to move the output prices closer to the optimum. So I don't think that that discriminates between performance standards on the one hand and a broad-based cap and trade or carbon tax on the other. What does, I think, discriminate and does tilt the balance in favor of intensity standards or performance standards, at least in the short term, might be political feasibility. This is what many states, jurisdictions are used to. We're familiar with it. We might be able to have a better chance of putting them in the short run, and therefore, why not go with what you can get, at least in the short term? The hope is that ultimately there could be a transition to what I would call augmented national level cap and trade or carbon tax system, which has some features that allows for some sector-specific differences. To me, that would be ideal. But I think I said I have a qualified endorsement of what you've suggested in the following sense. It may be a little bit hard, maybe some irreversibilities here. If we push too hard for intensity standards, it may be hard to retract them at some future point. It may delay the possibility of ultimately moving to cap and trade at a national level or a carbon tax. Rob Williams' paper, I think, will bring up these issues later, so I'm not going to try to adjudicate on it. But overall, with a little bit of trepidation, I support what you're recommending.
Nancy, back in 2008, a long time ago, LADWP was strongly opposed to the cap and trade program, suggesting it amounted to a massive transfer of wealth from Southern California to for-profit interests, wherever they may be. So now we're 10, 11 years later. in retrospect, has this come to pass, or has the state's managing of the allocation of permits and the phase-in ameliorated that? I don't know if this is something that the agency has looked at, or department.
Sure. So LADWP, as you noted, we're the nation's largest municipally owned utility. We're a fully vertically integrated electric utility. So we generate, transmit, and distribute electricity and serve the city of Los Angeles. And, we, LADWP, I think in 2008, looked very much like a pretty conventional utility. About half of our electricity came from coal outside of California, about a quarter from natural gas, and then some small amount of renewables, plus some other carbon-free, large hydro, and some nuclear. Today, that situation is very different, in part because of cap and trade, but as well because of other policies that accompanied both at the state level and at the city level as well. And so, we are subject to not only cap and trade, but California's renewable portfolio standard, California's energy efficiency goals, as well as sort of more long-term goals at the city level to reach carbon neutrality by 2050. And the impact of all of this on LADWP, and in fact on the entire power sector within California, has resulted in significant reductions in greenhouse gas emissions from the power sector. Mary Nichols mentioned earlier that California was doing pretty well in terms of meeting its goals around reducing greenhouse gas emissions, except for transportation. LADWP has reduced its greenhouse gas emissions by almost 50% from the 1990 levels, well ahead of the state's goals. And we've been able to do it in a way, in part because of some of the sort of smoothing effect of cap and trade, being able to manage the kind of big, chunky investments that come along with converting a largely fossil fuel-based system to a more renewables or zero carbon-based system. So that's been very helpful. And at some point, we because of where the city policymakers are, where the state policymakers are, it turned out it actually was a lot easier than I think we would have guessed back in 2008. Our rates remain relatively low certainly for Southern California. We are in the lowest sort of tier of rates for utilities in Southern California. While we've both reduced our greenhouse gas emissions and increased our renewable energy percentages and our overall zero carbon percentages. The one other thing I'd mention is a little sort of talked about accompaniment to AB 32 back in 2006 was something called SB 1368. Anybody knows California politics, everybody just talks about bill numbers. And it said you couldn't sign a long-term contract for power that didn't meet a natural gas standard. And the effect of that has led to the divestment of our coal resources, and we will be coal-free in 2025.
That's great. Okay, Nat. EDF is sort of the father of all these tradable programs. So it's great that you're here. From a political economy point of view, or just a political point of view, would tradable intensity targets be easier to sell to the U.S. Congress when they get off their current preoccupation relative to revenue neutral carbon tax?
So thanks, Charlie, and thanks to the Hamilton Project and Stanford for organizing this and having me on the panel. So my short answer to your question is no. So I mean, I'm a big fan of Carolyn's work, and it may be that we get to a point where the best we can have are sector by sector performance-based standards. But I don't agree with I have a different theory of politics, and so I don't agree that it's going to be easier to pass half a loaf or a quarter of a loaf than the full loaf. I'll say it's going to be hard to get legislation passed in Congress, but I'll tell you a couple reasons why I think it's not, okay, let me be an economist for a sec, right? There are sort of economies of scale here. And it's not twice as hard to pass something that is much more than twice as good. It may be a little bit harder to pass economy-wide market-based climate legislation, but I don't think it's that much harder than getting anything passed. And let me give you a couple of reasons for that. One is on the negative side. I spent a couple of years, as another panelist, Nancy certainly did, and Christy Goldfuss, who will be up later. I spent a couple of years in the Obama administration. And one of the first things we tried to do when I came in 2011 was get a clean electricity standard, a clean energy standard passed in the Congress. We thought this was right after the failure of the cap and trade legislation that Larry mentioned the year before. And we thought, let's scale down. Let's just do the electric power sector. Let's take all the ideas from senators, from senators on the Republican side, Senator Alexander, and Senator Lugar, and so on, and let's get something more reasonable passed. And I went in, because I was relatively senior in the White House, so I was going to meet with the senators, and from supposedly moderate senators, what we heard is, well, we can't work with you on that because President Obama is for it. And so this is on the negative side. I'll be more positive. The point is the opposition and the views, and EDF, by the way, is a bipartisan group, and I'm going to tell you how I think we need to get bipartisan legislation in a minute. But the point is that the biggest obstacle is not that people are concerned about a carbon tax or cap and trade, but they would love performance standards. The biggest obstacle is overcoming the hump of getting anything passed. And if we can do that, I think it'll be almost as easy to pass something really transformational as something that's less good. So how do we get over that hump? Well, I think we have a couple of things going for us. Number one, there's much more voter support than there ever has been for climate policy. It was always the case you ask voters, and Bob Rubin mentioned this, it's always been the case you ask voters, do you care about climate? And you get a solid majority saying yes, they care about it. But it's always been way down the priority list. That has changed. Primary voters in Iowa, in New Hampshire, across the country, in the Democratic side, even some independents, if you ask them what are their top tier issues, climate is at the top of the list. It is a #1 top priority issue in a way that it never has been before. So that's an important development. We didn't have that 12 years ago. A second development, I'm looking at Jerry Taylor, who will be up here later on, whose work with Niskanen Center has been a big part of the reason we're starting to see, not enough, but some Republican voices come out and cautiously be for some form of sensible market-based carbon tax legislation. And that's often because they're seeing people like Carlos Curbelo, who lost his seat in Florida, but almost held on to it because of his climate positions. They're seeing support among their own constituencies who are seeing the effects of climate. So the last thing I'll just say, and I think what makes us give a little bit more hope, and we can talk more about the politics. One lesson we did learn from the Waxman-Markey approach, which I was essentially involved in back in 2009, 2010, and this is tough for an economist to say, but don't lead with your chin. And what I mean by that is don't lead with the outcome. I love talking about cap and trade. I can talk to you about cap or carbon tax. I can talk to you about the elegance of that for hours. That is not what American voters care about. They want to hear why their lives are going to be better. They want to hear why their kids' lives are going to be better. So we need to start with the outcome. We need to start with the benefits. Next week, maybe, we hope, I'm looking at Christy, next week we expect there will be legislation introduced in the Congress that will be 100% Clean Economy Act. It's just a target, 100% clean across the entire economy. That means net zero emissions by 2050. That's just a big goal. It's not going to say how to get there because you need to start with that target, and then we'll have a couple of years to fill that out with the kind of market-based limit and price on emissions that I think we need to get there. So I'm more bullish on the prospects for getting something big passed. It obviously depends on what happens in next year, but since I'm not paid on the C4 side, I can't go too much into the electoral politics. Thanks.
Yeah, he does like to talk about tradable permits. There's a great YouTube video, the net, explaining how it works to the general population. It's great. So I think we have time to go around for a few more questions before we have to open to discussion amongst ourselves. So I'm going to start at the other end and change the order slightly. So, Larry, you've done some recent work in China. Do you view China's adoption of what I think is a tradable performance standard likely? Do you think it's likely to succeed? And what are the lessons for the U.S. and Europe from that experience?
Well, I'm really tempted to do what they do in the Democratic debates, which is to answer a different question. I would just want to
Your
say for the
prerogative.
record,
Your prerogative.
I'm stunned by what Nat said, that climate change is on the top of the list. Because I had always felt that even though we have a lot of the electorate that thinks climate problem is human caused and want to do something about it, the reason nothing gets done at the federal level is because it's not decisive, and that an elected official, or a senator or congressperson, can go against his or her constituents by voting correctly, on climate, and yet still get reelected if he or she is doing okay in terms of abortion or gun control or things like that. But this is a big change, and I'm really excited. Now, in answer to your question.
But I should say that anybody can interject an opinion on any of these questions.
Yeah. It's amazing to me that despite the China bashing that is going on, the trade wars, China seems fully committed. In fact, we'll put in place before the end of this calendar year a nationwide emissions trading system for CO2, which will more than double the amount of carbon covered through emissions trading internationally. This is a big, big step. And we can quibble about it, whether it's the perfect approach or not. Carolyn might at least find some comfort in the fact that it is an intensity-based approach. But she doesn't like, well, she's being a perfectionist. Let's acknowledge that. But I also would say in this regard, to me, the glass, 90% of the joy that I get from these policies, from China's effort, is just the fact they want to put a price on carbon nationwide, thus supplanting what's up to now been done in terms of 7 regional or municipal pilot programs. Whether it's done through a mass-based approach like cap and trade versus an intensity approach, yes, we can quibble about that, but to me it's big, big news that they're putting a price on. And I think it's a big step forward and can help launch future initiatives. And it's gratifying that they are committed to that. And I guess the last thing I'd say about that is, why are they committed to that? It may be as much for concerns about local air pollution, which is a co-benefit of these efforts, avoided health damages, than about climate per se. But whatever the ultimate motivation, I think it's a very important step. You could argue China's still got a long ways to go. They're still investing very heavily in coal-fired power plants, et cetera. But I think it's still encouraging that they're doing this.
Thank you. So let me ask Nancy a question. I can get myself straight here. So the premise of our panel is that there's no federal carbon tax, carbon price, I should say, induced by regulation or a tax. Yet some states, as we know, California as an example, do have a carbon price. So from your vantage point here in California, is a state carbon price an adequate substitute for a national carbon price? Would you behave differently with a national one?
We've sort of been a little bit through this experiment. We had the Clean Power Plan, and it would have sort of different effects on DWP, the LADWP, than just the California cap and trade regulations, because we had ownership interests outside of California in coal plants and natural gas plants. And the fact was that the way that California's sort of requirements on the power sector work, in the end, it didn't make much difference. That we would already have well exceeded any obligation we had under the Clean Power Plan just through the regulation on the load-serving entities in California. So I think going back to when right after AB 32 passed in 2006, the question was asked, could you do cap and trade on a single state basis? I think the answer in California is yes, and it has had the intended effect, certainly in the power sector. I think less clear, obviously, on other sectors, the different approach, for example, on fuels through the low carbon fuel standard, questions still around some of the industrial emissions, and certainly, as Mary noted, the transportation sector as a whole has been more difficult to deal with. So I think, we support and have supported national standards. We think that they're helpful in terms of the direction they send. Would it change DWP's investment trajectory? I think at this point, probably not a whole lot, because we are already on track because of statewide standards around both in cap and trade, renewable portfolio standards, energy efficiency standards, and other things that would be a component, for example, of a clean energy standard to drive down power sector emissions by around 80% by 2030. So the incremental value for at least the California utilities of a nationwide standard, I think, is probably pretty small. And the other thing I would just note is that I spend more time with utilities than I used to, and it's interesting to hear folks from other parts of the country talking about both divestment of coal assets, investment in renewables, because it makes sense in their electricity markets, and it's really not being driven by regulation in some cases. So I think the trend in the power sector is positive in terms of greenhouse gas reductions.
Of course, there's a big difference between electricity and other goods, and the source of the electricity, if it's out of state, still counts in California regulation, whereas if it's cement or something else,
Yeah,
then
it does, but I think at least in the electricity markets, the recognition I think in the West is that the electricity markets in the West are very much influenced by California. That's where the power is going. That's where the market is, and that projects that are being done or programs being done in other states are really have California in a sense in mind.
okay. We are running out of. I think we're running out of time. I'm not sure what time we're supposed to end. What?
2:10.
What'd you say?
2:10.
2:10. Okay. Well, we are running out of time.
15 minutes.
I didn't get a chance to ask the other two participants, but feel free to interject. If a question from the audience, you can answer that question and then answer some different question if you want. So the first question we have from the audience is, how will price volatility of tradable performance standards impact the prices of goods, especially during recessions? Carolyn's a good one for you.
I'll take that. So, any tradable credit system, you are potentially open to price volatility because it's not a tax, it's a fixed price. So an advantage of the tradable performance standard is that you have less of that price impact is going to be passed on into the price of the goods. And so you'll have sort of less volatility in terms of the goods prices. So if you think of electricity, the emissions price may be volatile, but if you're not paying for on average emissions up to the benchmark, that's not that cost isn't roving wildly. So it is less. Let me just take this opportunity actually to, so you still want to read my piece after this, that I actually agree with what Larry and Nat were saying. I would very much be in favor of a nationwide carbon price and just using sector-specific rebates, allocation, depending on your policy, to deal with carbon leakage and those issues. Sort of the premise here is if we're not going to get that legislation anytime soon. What can we do that might be acceptable to get going right away? And so that's really the idea. And we saw that in the Obama administration. They started developing clean power plan, so regulation, because they weren't going to get legislation. And so the idea is also thinking about, well, states beyond California. So say Reggie wants to go beyond just the electricity sector and the cap and trade system and start including industry. Especially as a state, when you're trying to do this, you not only have to worry about international competition, you have to worry about interstate competition. So you need to do it in a way that isn't going to tilt the playing field. So these are mechanisms that you can bring them in. So if you look at our neighbor to the north, Canada, where I'm spending some time now, the federal backstop plan. So climate policies are provincial, but if a province isn't doing enough for what it needs to, there's a backstop plan, and that plan is, okay, well, we're going to have a carbon tax for end use of fuels, but for industry, it's a tradable performance standard. But it's then linked to the tax. So one option for compliance is to go ahead and pay the tax. So there are ways of designing these. So if you can look ahead in a way that you can eventually merge that system into a carbon tax. So then the performance standard benchmarks, this is a way of dealing with your trade exposed sectors, or with a cap and trade system. As in California, essentially it's kind of like the energy intensive trade exposed sectors have performance standards that are tradable, but then they're all under the cap. So these the key feature is really this benchmark allocation that's output based. And so that's essentially the idea to, maybe this is a way to get going, especially in specific sectors and industries that are challenging, that we really need to make sure we get that carbon price signal in there soon, but we can't we can get a much stronger signal if we're not asking them to pay for all those emissions up to the benchmark.
Okay, here's a different spirit of a question, reminiscent of the lawsuit between Exxon and the New York State Attorney General. Isn't the main problem to limit the political influence of big business on climate policy? Anybody want to tackle that one?
I'll take that one on.
Okay, as a New Yorker.
Yeah, and as an environmental advocate, I think I have sort of two, maybe they sound like very different answers to the question, but I think there are two ways to think about that we need to have in mind at once. One is, we certainly do need to recognize and confront the political power of the big fossil fuel companies in particular. I think the amount of spending that has gone into lobbying against legislation at the federal level and at the state level is enormous sums, and we have to be realistic about that. We can't be naive about what we're facing on the political side, and that's one of the reasons the politics are so hard, is because there are some some of the world's largest companies have a vested interest in not seeing a really effective price on carbon. On the other hand, it is also true that there are some businesses that are willing to step up and take leadership and that are starting to get engaged. And we need to nurture that and support that. I think from our point of view, one of the ways you can sort of have those two things in your mind at the same time is to start by focusing, frankly, on some of the trade associations. And so one thing that all of us who care about this issue, need to work on putting it into is the company that, through its official, the company itself, the CEO says, we're dedicated to climate change, we think this is important, but they're also a member of the US Chamber of Commerce, which is working to fight and kill any kind of good legislation, or ALEC, the Legislative Council. So I think we need to start calling that out a little bit, and those of us in the advocacy community are starting to do that. But fundamentally, business is going to have a role to play, which can include a leadership role. And so we want to make sure, even as we're being realistic about some of the political forces, we also need to be finding areas for business leadership and supporting that and encouraging that and taking advantage of that in terms of the politics as well.
Well, I'd just add, in California at least, the oil companies have been among the biggest political spenders in the for state legislative races, really over the last, I don't know, decade or so, and yet they've had little success in stopping California's climate legislation, whether it's cap and trade or actually things like that included in cap and trade legislation, limits on offsets and other things. So I think, and to add to that, the SB 32, I believe, and at least SB 350, both of which were significant pieces of climate legislation, had the support of the state's utilities as well. I mean, active support. So, I think there are ways, particularly when I think the experience has been the regulatory side of this is well designed and functions reasonably well and gives businesses the certainty they need to make investments.
Yeah, and an initiative a few years ago, 60+% of the population rejected the repeal
Absolutely.
of
Funded by, as people are fond of saying, Texas oil companies.
Yes.
To try to overturn AB 32.
Okay, so here's another question, which I think is on a slightly different topic. What sort of adjustment assistance do you envision for those who are employed in industries affected by these proposals? In other words, there are going to be some winners and there are going to be some losers. How do we help the losers? Anybody want to handle that?
You want to go? Yeah.
Well, whether it's a carbon tax or a cap and trade with some auctioned allowances, or intensity standards where there's some auctioning involved, it still involves benchmarks. I think one important thing to consider is what to do with the revenues that come in. And one way of, I think, making a carbon tax system or an emissions pricing system more broadly more palatable is to use some of those revenues to provide compensation or assistance to those who would be economically harmed. And that is consistent. That can be done under any of the various systems that we've discussed here. And just for the record, I am in agreement with you. What I wanted to say simply is that the fact that you can customize under intensity standard doesn't discriminate in the sense you can customize under cap and trade. So that was my main point. I actually think that the biggest issue is political feasibility. And there you and I may have somewhat different opinion than that, but we can debate that later.
Just quickly on the transition assistance, I want to mention EDF is doing some work. This is a great example, I think, of collaboration between NGOs and researchers. The panel is sort of an illustration of that as well. But we're doing some work with Resources for the Future to take a really close look at what has succeeded in the past in terms of transition assistance. In other, there are other policies in the past where they've involved major transitions. We want to see what has worked and then use that to apply lessons going forward. Because this will be both, from a policy point of view, it's important that we do this in terms of the communities who are most affected, but also from a political point of view, it's going to be critical.
Okay, I think I'm going to have one more question for Nancy, and then I'll just let everybody have some closing remarks. Nancy, so this is for you, and what do you most want to see, both technology and process-wise, with Mayor Garcetti's announcement to refire 3 natural gas plants and retire and replace them with clean energy?
Yeah, so in February, Mayor Garcetti announced that we would not be proceeding with planned repowerings of 3 of our natural gas-fired power plants in the LA Basin. And so we are busily working on the plan, which will be some combination of major investments in our transmission and distribution system, which will be very interesting in a very urban environment. Distributed energy resources like solar and very significant role for energy storage, which really, I think, as California looks forward to 100% clean energy, or even these higher penetration of renewable, we have got to solve the storage. Electricity storage. So both kind of short term, which we get out of batteries, which is hours, daily storage, and probably seasonal storage as well. So we're looking at all of this, and I think we'll figure it out. But it's a pretty big challenge. On the 100% clean energy side, we're actually engaged in a multi-year study that the National Renewable Energy Laboratory is running for us. That really is an intense modeling of this electricity system to see how you can actually do it and keep the lights on.
Thank you. So let me start with Nat this time, and about a minute each.
So I will end on a kind of a hopeful note and also a unifying note around market-based instruments. I think, about 9 years ago, when the Waxman-Markey effort that Larry mentioned died in the Senate, I think about then there's a narrative set in that market-based instruments for climate policy were dead. And there was a little bit of a stasis for a few years, and we are seeing, I think, a reemergence and a sort of flowering of those instruments. And I'm optimistic enough that I think it's going to happen at the federal level too. But the Chinese, we talked about the Chinese system. EDF has been in Beijing for 25 years and is helping to advise the Chinese government on that system. But we also, if you look at the states, Colorado passed an aggressive standard. New Jersey and Virginia and now Pennsylvania are joining the greenhouse gas trading system in the Northeast. Oregon, we think, is going to take another crack at it and maybe join California. It could be that we have 5 more states within a year who are looking at cap and trade programs. And I think then that narrative will start to change. So I think it's important to keep in mind that across the board, whatever the details of the tradable permits or the market-based instrument, there are some green shoots and some hopeful signs to look for around the world.
Nancy.
Well, I think I'd just say that I think based on our experience dealing with California's policies and cities' policies, I can tell you, at least in the power sector, that the price on carbon works. Actually does drive down emissions. We now consider the cost of carbon because of the possibility we would have to buy allowances when we dispatch our system, and it has resulted in way faster reductions in greenhouse gas emissions than we would have just achieved by regulation. So I think both the explicit and implicit price of carbon has really changed the way we operate.
So you included the social cost of carbon in your
in a sense.
cost.
I don't know that economists would agree that we use the right social cost of carbon. The easiest thing for us to do is to use the allowance price.
Yeah. Okay. Carolyn.
Yeah. So yes, I think it's important to recognize that carbon pricing works. There are many ways to get to it, and standards can play a role in that. We heard Mary Nichols say that that the cap and trade system is not the only thing driving decarbonization in California. There are a lot of standards and other policies. And we also see in Europe that the emissions trading system is not the be-all and end-all. There are a lot of other additional policies. And you actually see more and more member states in the EU, including my new country, the Netherlands, being dissatisfied with the level of the prices in the emissions trading system. They've been too low, and they're too low to drive decarbonization, especially in the industrial sector. So they're looking at standards on top of the cap and trade system as a way of bringing in a kind of floor price in a way that alleviates competitiveness concerns and provides stronger signals to industry. So that's another option for using these tools.
I guess the key thing I think about a lot is that I believe we have a lot of really good ideas coming from economists, sociologists, natural scientists, and others. And the real constraint, and we also have a lot of the American public at the grassroots level favoring climate action. I think a big challenge, though, is to overcome special interests, which allow the decision makers in the US at the federal level to deviate from the general will of the public. And I don't have a solution to that, and I just put it out there. Maybe that's something that the following roundtables will address to some degree. But to me, that's a key challenge. It's not the ideas, it's getting the political backing.
Well, thank you. Well, join me in thanking the panel.